Well, now we turn our attention to the media and the unique challenges and insights of the Jewish media in particular. And with us today for our panel covering the world through a Jewish lens are Ron Kampeas, Washington Bureau Chief of JTA, and Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate. Before coming to the JTA, Ron worked at the Associated Press, where he spent more than a decade in its bureaus in Jerusalem, New York, London, and Washington. He's reported from Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, Bosnia, and West Africa. And while living in Israel, he also worked for the Jerusalem Post. Jonathan is the award-winning editor-in-chief of JNS.org and a senior contributor to The Federalist, as well as a columnist for the New York Post, Newsweek, Haaretz, and Israel Hayom, as well as a regular contributor for the Washington Examiner and Commentary magazine. In his writing, he covers on a daily basis the American political scene, foreign policy, the U.S.-Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, and the Jewish world, as well as the arts. He's also host of the weekly JNS Top Story podcast. Previous to this role, Jonathan was first executive editor and then senior online editor and chief political blogger for Commentary magazine. He was editor-in-chief of the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia, and before that, was the editor of the Connecticut Jewish Ledger. He's won more than 50 awards for his writing and appears regularly on television, commentating on politics and foreign policy. Welcome, Ron. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for having us.
Well, let's start with the basic question. What are some of the challenges that you face as journalists at Jewish organizations? Can you be a cheerleader as well as an objective journalist? Is that expected? Is it necessary? Is it not acceptable? So, Ron, why don't you take first crack?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me here. And I want to thank B'nai B'rith for being B'nai B'rith. Obviously, we've been aware of it all our lives, but especially for its contributions to Jewish media. I knew Wolf Matzdorf, who was one of the great journalists. It's wonderful knowing that there's an award out there in his name. So what are the challenges of being a Jewish journalist? Yes, you're expected to be a cheerleader. I think every journalist is expected to be a cheerleader to a certain degree, depending on the circumstance. When I was working at the Associated Press, when the Iraq War broke out, and there were pressures on the Associated Press to be cheerleaders for that war. And the same thing here. And, it's something that, to a certain extent, one has to resist. One has to be try and separate oneself from the story as much as possible. The big exception I found in Jewish journalism, it's a kind of a rare exception, but it's telling as well, is that when a Jewish person is in peril and that person is newsworthy, if the fact that they're in peril is newsworthy, we will nonetheless not cover the story or publish that they're Jewish if that could contribute to their peril. That's like the one, that's something I don't know so much like if you're at a secular news organization or a mainstream media, that's something you would do, but we've done that multiple times. But otherwise, I think the function of media is to tell you what's coming, and what's coming might make you feel good or might make you feel good, or it might be the fault of your greater community, or it might be a threat to your greater community, but you still have to know what's coming, and you have to know what's happening today, and that's sort of and I think that and Jonathan will probably back me up on this. I think that our editors protect us from the pressures that we might have to cover one thing in a particular way or another.
So, Jonathan, I'm trying to imagine what your day is like. So you've got one day there's a terrorist incident, there's a BDS story, there's an anti-Semitic outbreak or incident somewhere. So, Jonathan, from that point, where do you start? Now you're looking at this through a Jewish lens.
I think one has to follow the news. It's a matter of judgment. What's the most important story on any given day? Obviously, those involving, catastrophes, loss of life, wars, serious diplomatic crises, they're always going to be at the top, at the top of the agenda. Over, human interest stories or just sort of ordinary features telling about about Jewish life. I think we balance that just by, the only way you can do that is through experience and trying to kind of filter out the noise about the Jewish world, or what various organizations or interests are trying to promote, as opposed to what you see as someone with some experience in the news business as the real issues. Just to get back to what Ron addressed, I mean, he and I are both in the national Jewish media, in the two wire services. Those of our colleagues who are local Jewish journalists are in a very different position, than we are. And speaking as someone who edited local Jewish newspapers, I know this well. It's very hard to cover your own community, your own sectarian Jewish community, honestly. And there are always limitations on it. Some of the limitations are imposed by who you work for. If you work for a federation, you cannot cover them honestly any more than you can cover any publisher honestly, because after all, everybody works for somebody. I can recall one time being told by a board member at a former publication that I was at, a local publication, saying that I wasn't, by our newspaper, covering the news about the community, which wasn't necessarily happy news, that I wasn't making the donors happy. And I responded that unfortunately I was not in the happiness business. I was in journalism, and you have to roll with that. So that is our dilemma. But even within that, of course we have we want to promote the community, because the community is our lifeblood. The organizations, we don't want them to fail, we want them to succeed. And we also are operating in a sort of broader context of the, those big stories you just referenced. It depends what your point of view, what your purpose, what your mission as a publication is. As a Jewish publication and, as a Zionist publication, you are, I think we're obligated to sort of promote the debate and facilitate the debate about the issues. But there are limits to that debate, within I see our, my own publication, and frankly, any publication I've ever worked for in the Jewish world. So we're Zionist publications. We're part of the Zionist debate. We're not debating whether there ought to be a Jewish state. That's not my job to facilitate that debate.
Well, you've both been journalists for some time.
Yeah.
Can you speak about, because this is something, I won't say this is new. It's relatively new, I guess, during the span of time. Speak about the polarization of the news, of the echo chamber that exists when news consumers only go to news outlets that they deem sympathetic or in line with their views. There's much more compartmentalization today. When you get up in the morning, you go to your favorite website. Ron, how do you see that, the polarization that's taking place today?
It makes things very difficult. And I find that people often, when they criticize, how come you haven't done this, or how come you have done this, how come you've written something in a certain way, they haven't seen the reporting on the other side. And I think it just sort of, it wraps people up in their own own worlds a little too much. And I'm just to grab an example out of my head, there was a situation yesterday where somebody for If Not Now, which is the non-Zionist organization, Jewish organization, posted something saying there were Bundists and there were Zionists and that argument hasn't ended or something like that. And somebody, I think Sarah Yael Hirschhorn said, well, maybe it hasn't ended, but kind of like the Holocaust kind of decided it in a sense, which was a successful outcome. And people started from the left, and she's like, I guess she's on the left. They started piling on her, saying, how can you say that? It's like comparing, it's like they compared it to like a woman being responsible for having been raped. And I thought, think about this. There's actually an argument going on in the national conversation right now, at which you probably most of you, meaning the liberals who are attacking her, I know which side you're on, in which there is somebody who is anti-COVID and anti-vaxxer, or an anti-vaxxer will say will preach against vaccine, a Christian evangelical talk shows, for instance, and they'll die. And then people will start saying, well, you see, this is a lesson in that thing. And people from the right will accuse them of saying, oh, you're jumping on this poor man's death. You're exploiting it. And you're not. You're discussing what is the best historical way to approach a problem. So why can't you take that lens where you look at that and you have hard conversations about that, and take it and look at it the Zionist issue? And because people aren't listening to one another, they're not self-aware, and I think that's that's a big problem right now. It's like like you said, it's hard sometimes to get people. You try and direct them to the information that you're using and the objective information that you're using to sort of persuade them, but I think people are mostly unpersuadable these days.
Yeah, Jonathan, this kind of it reflects a certain divisiveness in the community. How do you see this, the polarization issue?
Well, we're living on the same planet as everybody else in this country. It has been true, not for a short time, for at least 10, 15 years, that Americans are divided by, and we're speaking, I know, to an international audience, and I'm sure it plays out in somewhat the same way elsewhere, but we're divided by the outlets that we read, listen to, and watch. And that divide is stark, and it's growing. It got worse in the last 5 years or so because of the rise, or 5 or 6 years or so, depending on how you're dating it, by the rise of social media. Now, you said, you referenced before about people going to their favorite website. I have seen serious research that shows that the majority of people were getting their news not by going to their website, but by going to their Facebook feed or Twitter, if that's their thing. And what do we know about Facebook and Twitter? You can isolate yourself from any point of view that doesn't confirm your pre-existing biases and opinions. And indeed, that is what most people do. They delete posts, they delete things that they don't like. They unfriend people that post things that they disagree with. That is why, as a country, as a nation, we've lost the ability to listen to each other, to credit each other with good motives. And within the Jewish community, it's the same thing on our own issues, whether it's over Israel or any other division, Israel being the most prominent. And there's no listening. There's no cross-pollination. It's very hard. I mean, look, even within, sort of those outlets in the mainstream press, like the New York Times, which has gone pretty hard left in the last decade or so. And anytime they publish, which is not that often, anything which contradicts anything else, look at the comments. People go nuts. Why is Bret Stephens still here? Why did you publish this thing by somebody, that somebody who isn't telling us what we want to hear? And on the right, the same thing happens, for sure. And that is a formula, not merely for polarization, but for a tribal culture war, which is exactly what we're living through right now.
Right. I mean, you see it. You saw it. It came out a little bit after the death of Fred Hyatt, the opinion page editor of the Washington Post, who in 2016 found that the conservatives that he'd cultivated for the page, the op-ed page, were mostly anti-Trumpers. So he made an effort. He went out and he found people who were pro-Trump because those ideas needed to be on the opinion page. And he was excoriated for it to a certain degree by the left, but he actually did a valuable service. You want to get the range of ideas if you're, I'm ancient. I actually open the paper and read the print edition, and I found that valuable to have that range of opinion in there.
Living in an era of breaking news, how do you balance coverage of domestic versus foreign policy issues at your organizations? And we have the largest Jewish community in the world here in the United States. There's a lot going on in the communities. There, of course, anti-Semitism is rife, but there are other issues, and yet foreign policy, I mean, we're better informed today, at the beginning of the day, on the Iranian issue, on immigration issues, home and abroad, and so forth. How do you make that balance? Jonathan?
Well, I think, as I said, you follow the news. There's news that comes out of Israel. There's news that comes out of the United States. We have to do our best to be on top of both. Both of the organizations that are represented on this panel are not, vast, news organizations with armies of reporters and editors. We do the best we can with smaller staffs, but still, I have, frankly, a great staff in Israel, a great Israel bureau. People can write about the military issues, political issues, and we actually sort of had to develop a better domestic, coverage, which we've been doing. You have to do both. That said, what's interesting to me is always saying, well, what are they clicking on? What does the audience want? Well, the audience that is interested in Jewish news really is interested in Israel. We cannot short that because that's the biggest Jewish story. And indeed it is. It's not just a question of their preference. The fate of the Jewish world, the fate of the Jewish future is really on the line in Israel in a way that even as important, and I would correct there actually are now more Jews in Israel than there are in the United States, no matter who's doing the counting or how they're counting, which is a story and a controversy in of itself, as we know. We're very oriented towards Israel. At the same time, stuff that goes on in Washington, stuff that happens in New York, the movement, the various denominations, the organizations, the wars between the organizations, the alphabet soup wars that have gotten worse, unfortunately, in recent years, even as some of the memberships of some of these organizations that are not as vast as, say, the B'nai B'rith have dwindled. The fights continue to grow bitter. We have to try to do both. It's like anything else. You got to walk and chew gum at the same time. At the same, but having said that, if there is fighting going on along the border in Gaza, if people are getting murdered, in terrorist attacks in Jerusalem or somewhere else, in Israel, that goes right to the top of my agenda, because that's hard news. It's not just, if it bleeds, it leads, the old journalism cliche. It's because this is life and death stuff. The arguments between the denominations can wait at a moment like that. But we have to be able to understand both. And as an organization, and the same is true for JTA, my friends there, we have our feet planted on both continents. Right. We are looking at both. We are in a probably unique position, unlike, say, our colleagues in the Israeli media or our colleagues in the secular media here, of having some idea about both of these countries and how they work and how they are, and the ability to interpret, what goes on in Israel to even American Jewish audiences who may think they understand Israel, but often really don't, and vice versa. So that's what we have to do.
Yeah. Well, Ron, how do you address the balance question, or is it just an irrelevant question? As Jonathan has just said, what goes right to the top is what's happening now, and we know more now than we ever knew of what's going on at the moment. So how do you deal with it?
It's not an irrelevant question, and one of the things that we're always wondering is, so what, and Jonathan actually just got to this, is what value added can we bring to the conversation? And so what we found is, like, we've always had this internal debate. If we're covering Israel every day, and people are reading the Jerusalem Post or Haaretz or Times of Israel or Israel Today first, why are we spending those resources on something that they're going to read elsewhere in any case? And then suddenly, exactly like Jonathan says, a war will break out, and you feel you have to be on top of that because you're a Jewish organization. These are Jews in peril. This is a Jewish story, and you want to get people there. So, obviously, we have staff in Israel, and one of the ways we try to navigate it are uncovering stories of a specific diaspora Israel relevance, whether that has to do with the development of the diaspora ministry under Nachman Shai and their kind of outreach, whether it has to do with the stake that the various denominations here feel they have in Israel, the Orthodox, the Reform, and the Conservative. We try and be on top of those stories, and we try and interpret, as Jonathan said, we try and interpret both governments to both readerships. That we have a Hebrew outlet in Israel now that supplies news stories, and they are looking specifically for stories that will explain American Jews a little better to Israelis. I mean, and I think that's the other thing. It's like we try and also we really want to look for those stories, not just for Israeli readers, obviously, but for all kinds of readers, just the Jewish journeys that people have, and because sometimes I think it's that's underreported, and we want to get those stories out as well. We had just a terrific story yesterday about a guy in New York who wrote his obituary for his mother who died in El Paso, calling her, an outspoken redneck Jew from the South, and it was just such a, it shone a light on a kind of an American Jewish story that you wouldn't normally read about, and so we also want to get those stories out there.
I read that story, and I know it's gone viral. It's a great story. Well, as clearly indicated in my introductions of you both, we can use the appellation veteran for both of you. So, Jonathan, starting with you, can you each tell us a highlight of your career working for Jewish news outlets? What stands out?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think we have to understand our work, as a body of work. We get up every day, and we have stories to edit, stories to write, and our reward for doing a good job is that we get to do it again the next day and the next week. And if we are veterans, which is a nice word, there are other words for that.
Light word.
Yeah, right. We just keep going on. I can recall. Listen, this is a great job. This is a lot of fun. I have, it's a great blessing to do what you believe in, what you think is important, what you think is of value, and to actually make a living at it. And, both of us have been fortunate enough to be able to do that. I've had lots of interesting experiences. I think one of the things, I'll tell a story. One of the traps the journalists, and really anybody can get into, is this idea, well, we're going to write a story and we're going to change the world. It's just like, and this is one story to lead into another. I can recall right at the beginning of my career when I had my first editing job, when the Soviet Union was still in existence and we're on its last days, and Gorbachev had done something that the Jews didn't like. Don't ask me what it was, but it was something that the Jews didn't like. And I received a call in my office, and from a reader who wanted to know what I was going to do about it, about Gorbachev and the And my response was, well, I was going to write a very stern editorial, and if that didn't fix him, I don't know what would. But occasionally one does write something that people notice, and it can change people, not most people. And just, on one foot, I wrote a piece back in the 90s during the first Netanyahu government when Natan Sharansky was still being a politician rather than just, a hero and, someone, a great role model for the Jewish people. And he was the head of, I think, the Commerce Ministry or something like that. And I was at that time writing a lot in both, about human rights violations in China. And I had read, I think, a JTA, brief about Sharansky meeting with Chinese officials. And, it was just sort of mutual congratulations. Yeah, it's so nice. And I wrote a column saying, come on, Sharansky, you're a human rights icon. You should do something about that. You should speak up. This is a Jewish value, and this is something that, we expect people like you to do. I actually tried to get comment from his office. They told me, to shove it. The piece went out. It was published in the Jerusalem Post, and it just kind of, this was at the beginning of things going viral, because this is a while ago, but it got a lot of notice. And several weeks later, I get a call, I think it's 6 a.m. Here on the East Coast, from the person whom I'd left my phone number with when I asked for comment the first time. And it was, one of Sharansky's office, who was furious and telling me that Sharansky was going to meet with some Chinese officials today. And he had asked the foreign ministry in Israel for the names of some prisoners to ask for their release. and the government, the foreign ministry told him to shut up and mind his own business. That was up to the Americans to do something about that, not Israel. This is a debate that goes on to this moment about things like the Uyghurs, and that Sharansky said, no, I'm going to speak about this stuff. And so Sharansky's aide, who had obviously unsuccessfully tried to talk him out of it, said, you're ruining him and it's all your fault. And I hope you'll write about this. And I said, you're damn right I'll write about it. And, that was one of the few cases in my career where I actually wrote something and someone, in power actually tried to do something as a result of it. That doesn't happen very often. And sometimes it takes, someone who's really not a politician, Sean Sharansky never has been, to do it. But every once in a while, you do something like that. And maybe it's just an anecdote, but I think it points us in the direction of what we should be trying to do.
Yeah, Ron, you, among many other things, you have covered the Washington scene very closely for many years. So I'm wondering whether it's, your experience was something that occurred here in Washington, or it was generated out of Washington.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I switched from the Associated Press to the JTA because I was a sort of a kind of called an enterprise reporter, but it was like general assignment reporter for the JTA, and I desperately wanted a beat. And JTA gave me a beat, and it was a beat that I loved. And I just got into because I was knowledgeable about it. And it's just like, it's the greatest thing for a journalist is to find things out and to share them with your readers. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that so much. And I think the story that's emblematic of what, a Jewish reporter can do and how he can be influential for me is the whole AIPAC espionage case in the 2000s. And in which, as soon as the two top employees at AIPAC were arrested in this espionage case, the narrative in the media immediately became, oh, Jonathan Pollard again. There was this suspicion that pro-Israel Jews were somehow implicated in spying. And the narrative, well, there was no narrative in the organized Jewish world. It was like fear, because this was government being turned against an organized Jewish body, and people shut down and didn't want to comment. And so I was, knowing the organized Jewish world, I was able to pick through the anomalies in the story that the people who had arrested these two guys wanted to peddle, and which a lot of the media had eagerly picked up, and to create a different narrative that this had to do with, the main impetus towards this was a desire by the intelligence community or the security community. It transcends parties. It goes from government to government to figure out a way to stop leaks. And they didn't want to, and it's always easier to go after the leakers than the people that's being leaked to. But in this case, they wanted to go after the people that were being leaked to, and they wanted to create an atmosphere that would inhibit people from cultivating leaks. And in fact, it went after journalists in a way, even though it was two lobbyists that were targeted. And I saw that as I started writing the stories, and this was a time, the internet was up and running. This was in the mid-2000s. I saw that people who covered national security for national publications were reading my stuff, and that began to shape the story. And I think it shaped the narrative to a degree. And that, I think, was real value added from somebody who knew how ridiculous the idea was initially that somehow lobbyists were implicated in espionage, simply because you knew the lobbyists. You covered AIPAC day to day. You were a journalist who knew that and these were not people who were out to subvert, American interests. Quite the opposite. And then you also, and you were able to see the flaws that led to this prevailing narrative. And I like to think that JTA, by covering it the way we did, we helped contribute to a kind of rebalancing of the narrative and inhibited the idea that somehow, lobbying organizations had to cut themselves off at the head in order to continue to exist in the American political firmament.
So, of course, Israel is very much at the center of what we all do, and many of us live here. We do have, on this particular webinar, we have many outside the United States. So let me ask a question that you address every day. Jonathan, what do you see ahead in light of the two relatively new governments, still relatively new, in Washington and Jerusalem, in terms of that bilateral relationship? Because you've got Iran, you've got the Palestinian issue, you've got visa waiver now has become an issue. So Jonathan, why don't you take a crack at that first? And what do you see ahead in terms of that relationship?
Well, I think clearly both the sort of the good news is that both the Biden administration, certainly President Biden, I would say, and the government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid in Israel, they both have a clear interest in not turning things into a complete dust up and going in, basically going to rhetorical war with each other, as was the case certainly between the Obama administration and the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu. They both want that, but as we have seen over the course of the year, just because you want that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. The Biden administration, staffed as it is in its foreign policy team with Obama alumni, had a very different view of what dealing with Iran should be than even a government which is as much of the left and center as it is of the right in Israel. That is not something that is not a difference that can be breached. And as we're reading, the stories in the New York Times every week with the leaks orchestrated from Washington and to some extent from Jerusalem, it's clear they're heading to a very profound disagreement. The story last week about secret talks between the Biden administration and the Iranians, that resonates for those of us who remembered when that was what led to the Iran deal in 2000, the negotiations from 2013 to 2015. There's really no way that can be papered over in the end. Israel has a very different view of it, and that government, precarious it is, although in its the reason why it has survived and why it may well survive is that everybody in it has very good reason to stay in it, despite their disagreements and despite the fact that they're at cross purposes with each other, because the alternative is Netanyahu, and that's the one thing they agree on. They don't want Netanyahu to come back. They don't want there to be another election. But issues prop up. The issue with the Jerusalem consulate, with Biden, the administration wants to reopen it. They're downplaying it. It appears they may have put it on hold for the moment. But that's still going to lead to increasing disagreement. There's going to be rhetorical conflict over it. The question is, how committed is the Biden administration to pursuing diplomacy to the bitter end? Is it diplomacy for its own end? Are they willing to accept something that is even weaker than the 2015 deal in order to say that diplomacy has triumphed? That's inevitably going to put Bennett and Lapid in a position where they're going to have to do more than just speak behind the scenes. At some point, this is going to go into the open. I don't think there's any way to avoid it. And when that happens, then it won't be about Netanyahu, it won't be about Obama, it'll be about the issues, which is what it's always been.
Yeah.
Ron?
No, I think that's exactly right. Fortunately, I just wrote a story about this, so I have it all in my head. But yeah, exactly. I think that the Palestinian issues, the issues with the Palestinians, they're likely to, with a degree of success, to keep those behind closed doors. The consulate is off the table for now. I think that Iran is just it's something that the Israelis see as an existential threat that the Americans want to manage, and you don't manage existential threats. I mean, the late Michael Adler, who was a great journalist for AFP, he just put it in the most succinct way for me once, where he said he spoke to a top security official and during the negotiations for the Iran deal, ahead of the Iran deal, and he said to the Israeli security official, like, the Iranians have a self-interest in not starting a nuclear conflagration. Do you really think that they're going to want to get to that point where that's that provocative? And the official said, no, I agree with you, except here in Israel, when somebody even makes an empty threat about going nuclear, we have to take that seriously in a way that Americans don't necessarily have to take that seriously. And that's the essence of the conflict. Israelis can never ever stand down, I think, from trying to prevent Iran from going nuclear. It can't be managed. I think Max Boot had a column in the Washington Post the other day that maybe it can be managed, maybe there's no other way except for it to be managed. It's a very American point of view. It's just, from an Israeli perspective, it's not a manageable prospect. I mean, God help us, we might get to a point where the Israelis are having to manage it, but it's just that puts Israel in such a more precarious position that I think that's something, like Jonathan says, it will inevitably have to be play out in an open exchange rather than behind closed doors.
Well, we just got a couple of minutes left, and I thought I would throw out a question that perhaps would take 3 hours to discuss. But I'd like to talk about anti-Semitism because both of your news organizations cover it so closely. Why? I'm curious about, because you follow these things every day. Why do you think there is a spike? We've seen it. It's been growing for years. The number of incidents, for example, always reported. There's a real trajectory over the last decade, at least in this country. Elsewhere, we see what's going on in Europe. How do you explain it? You write about it, report about it, analyze it, but how do you explain it, Jonathan?
Well, yes, 3 hour, week-long discussion. Listen, there are some basic principles about understanding anti-Semitism that we can't forget. Anti-Semitism is always about the anti-Semites. It's not about the Jews. Anti-Semites hate Jews for all sorts of reasons, because they're rich, because they're poor, because they assimilate, because they don't assimilate. They hate Israel not for what it does, but for what it is. And Israel is the stand-in for for the Jew, for the eternal Jew in the minds of many anti-Semites now. In that sense, it's not changed. And anti-Semitism is also, it's a way of organizing politics. It's not just, it's not just another form of hate or being unkind to people. It is always an intensely political thing. It's a virus that attaches itself to every ideology, whether it was fascism, Nazism, Islamism, communism. So it's always there. It exists on the far right and it exists on the left. Our problem today in covering anti-Semitism, or indeed in reacting as a community to anti-Semitism, is that polarization issue, which you mentioned before and which we addressed. It's very easy to see anti-Semitism in people who you disagree with on other issues. If you're on the right, it's easy to see it on the left. If you're on the left, it's easy to see it on the right. In both cases, it's very hard to see it with people that you are to some extent aligned with. And that's why that is such a challenge. And, specifically, issues about, Ilhan Omar, who's, sort of a gift that keeps giving to Jewish journalists, that's a tough thing, because it's very difficult for the left to do as, Ted Deutsch did, a Democrat, to turn to the squad and said, you're marketing anti-Semitism. That's something that a lot of people on the left don't want to do. There's kind of a popular front sensibility, and that's true and it's true on the right as well. And it's really handicapped. It's handicapped some of our national organizations who are supposed to be doing something about anti-Semitism, because some of them see it, that it's the far right, the traditional ideas about extreme anti-Semitism rooted in sort of white nationalist, white supremacist ideas. Most American Jews who are overwhelmingly liberal and democratic understand that. That's a kind of anti-Semitism. That's the anti-Semitism of their nightmares. It's like the guys with the tiki torches in Charlottesville. That looked like Nuremberg. Anti-Semitism, which is based in sort of a denying of Jews' rights that you wouldn't think to deny anyone else, and anti-Zionism in BDS movements, that's harder for them to wrap their brains around or to see as a threat. And that's our challenge as a community, to be clear-eyed about, both these forms of anti-Semitism, to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Seems very obvious, seems very simple, but honestly, it's very difficult for most of us, because as I said, we're living on the same planet as everyone else in this country, and polarization has really altered our ability to think clearly about these issues.
Ron, you
Yeah.
get the last word.
No, I think it's something that we've been talking about since probably both of us have been in the Jewish professional business in the 1980s. It's just the distance from the Holocaust. We in the West, at least, got kind of reprieve after the Holocaust because its horrors were so stark. And as the memory recedes, you get more and more permission to vent. And I wrote about recently about the 20th anniversary, which is what you're focused on, of Durban, and how it became evident there. I think that there was a curtain lifted on the left to use certain tropes and use certain language that delegitimized Israel and Jews. And so to the extent that you had this bizarre thing at the University of Toronto recently where they were talking about controlling what kind of kosher food can come onto the campus. It can't be Israel affiliated. What kosher food, according to at least to their standards, isn't affiliated to Israel. And there was a blindness to seeing how that had an effect it was an anti-Semitic effect. And Jonathan's right. There is a blindness in both parties to wanting to deal with it, except with exceptions like Ted Deutsch, and I think the Republican Jewish Coalition has also done good work in exposing anti-Semites on the right. But it's just more the exception than the rule, and you see it. I mean, when Farrakhan's not on the left or the right, he's kind of his own creation. But he has affiliations with people on the left, and you've had there were three of the four founders, not the three founders, but three of the four women who at one point were leading the Women's March were somehow affiliated with Farrakhan, and there was great resistance to exposing on the left to exposing that and to countering that. And eventually, they did resign, so that was something. But Farrakhan uses words to describe Jews like termites. You see those words on the far right as well. I'm sure that the white supremacists who want to call Jews termites may not be cognizant of the fact that they're picking up an echo that Farrakhan has sent out into the ether, but they are, and it works the other way as well. And there's this, and the tragedy of all this is that you and I and Jonathan can easily identify the tropes that go across both sides of the polarization divide, and it's trying to get people to understand how that works and how if you're talking about Jews controlling politics, how chastising Rashida Tlaib for making those insinuations is an effective way of actually, if you're on the left, of actually marginalizing the people on the right that you're worried about. That it actually helps. It doesn't just help because it makes you look good. It helps because you're actually centering the issue of why it's toxic to claim that Jews control politics, and vice versa. So, you're asking me for answers. I don't have any, but I think that it's just that there's as time goes on, permission has been given to unleash tropes both on the left and more recently on the right as well. And we're just living in that kind of environment now.
Well, we started this discussion by talking about websites, and I can tell you this. I do start my day reading Jonathan Tobin and Ron Kampeas. We thank you both for all of the tremendous work that you do every day. We see it, we follow you both, and thank you for joining us today at the Leadership Forum.
Thank you for having us.